So I think it's right now 11:02. For the sake of time, let's get started. Um, so I see that we have attendees populating, and I think that number is going to continue growing. But let me, on behalf of the ISOP Education Working Group, welcome all of you to this webinar. My name is Yash Kapoor, and I'm a quantitative pharmacologist at Merck. This ISOP working group specifically focuses on communication and soft skills, and our mission is to help current and future quantitative pharmacologists to communicate more effectively with each other and with key stakeholders while focusing on our values of diversity, inclusiveness, acceptance, and empathy. So that's our working group, but let me also now introduce our key speaker, Dr. Frank Douglas. Frank is an award-winning industry veteran with more than 3 decades of experience in pharmaceuticals and healthcare. Frank has held leadership roles in both large and small biopharmaceutical companies. Prominent among them was his role as executive vice president and member of the board of management of Aventis, which is part of Sanofi now. There, he was responsible for global research, development, regulatory affairs, and marketing support. He was also chief scientific advisor of Bayer Healthcare and served on board of several pharmaceutical companies, including as chairman for Aventis Pharmaceutical. Now, Frank has received numerous awards, as you can imagine, 3 decades of work. Of note, though I'll mention a couple of them, which I found very interesting. He was the recipient of the 2007 Black History Makers Award. And he was also honored twice as a global pharmaceutical R&D Director of the Year in recognition for his leadership and success in improving innovation and productivity in pharmaceutical companies. I would certainly want to hear more from Frank. And so today he will be discussing on a topic of cultural sensitivity. And before we turn to Frank, I will ask Yuan to introduce our panelists today. Yuan?
Thank you, Yash. Hello, everyone. Really happy to be here today and co-host this webinar together with Yash. My name is Yuan Xiong, and I'm a scientific director within the clinical pharmacology and the pharmacometrics at the Janssen Pharmaceutical Companies of Johnson & Johnson. It's my great pleasure to introduce our stellar panelists today. Let me start from the ladies. Our first panelist is Valerie Nock, who is joining us from Germany. Dr. Nock is the global head of pharmacometrics at Boehringer Ingelheim, leading a group of more than 30 pharmacometricians from 15 different nations in Germany and the US. Together with her group, she is promoting the application of model-informed drug development across the entire clinical portfolio of Boehringer Ingelheim to enable data-based decision-making within the clinical development programs and in interactions with regulators. Before joining Boehringer Ingelheim about 10 years ago, Dr. Nock studied pharmacy at the University of Tübingen and got her PhD in the field of pharmacometrics from Freie Universität Berlin. Our second panelist is Marcia Brown Rayford, who is joining us from her office out of Atlanta, Georgia. Marcia is VP of Global Life Sciences R&D at RGT with 30 years experience in pharma, biotech, and medical device R&D in scientific and operational optimization, strategic transformation, and operational excellence. Marcia's career began at Merck as a research chemical engineer in drug development, advancing such compounds as Singulair, Crixivan, ivermectin, and Heartgard. Marcia later joined the PwC's life science practice, leading global consulting initiatives. She led efforts to design modern simulation capabilities and develop digital roadmaps to optimize pharmacometrics methodologies and productivity. Her contributions include over $500 million in efficiencies. Marcia is the Lean Six Sigma Black Belt and project and change management expert. She also sits on the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Council at RGT and is an inaugural and founder member. Monsieur holds a bachelor's degree in chemical engineering from Washington University in St. Louis and MBAs from the Wharton School in Strategic Management, Entrepreneurial Management, and Finance. Our next panelist is Mahesh Samtani, who is joining us from New Jersey. Dr. Samtani is the Senior Director and Group Leader within the Clinical Pharmacology and Pharmacometrics Department at Janssen R&D. His interests are in the areas of clinical pharmacology, clinical trial simulations, and population PK/PD modeling. He received his pharmacy training followed by master's and PhD degrees in pharmaceutical sciences. Over the past 17 years at Janssen R&D, he has held roles of increasing responsibility related to pharmacometrics and clinical pharmacology. He currently leads the US Pharmacometrics Group at Janssen R&D. Our warmest welcome to Valerie, Monsieur, and Mahesh.
Thank you.
With that, I think we would turn to you, Frank, to start our discussion. So I believe I'm sharing the slides. I'm just wanting to confirm that I'm sharing the slide.
Yes, yes,
Okay,
I can
excellent.
see the slide. Thank you, Yash.
On to you.
Okay, thank you. And I'd like to thank Mark, Yash, and Yuan for inviting me to share this discussion with you. I will, first of all, let you know that I sort of approach this whole issue of cultural sensitivity, D&I, somewhat differently, in that I tend to focus on the business and what one needs to do in a business to be successful and to work well together. Next slide. I basically ask myself a simple question, and that is, why do we do the things we do? And in my view, there are three reasons why we do the things we do. Perhaps the deepest of them is there is something within us that has to do with our morality or deep principles, and that drives us. At another level, it's be sure that the social environment in which we're in, whether it's the family, the community, etc., is working well. And the third, when we're at work, it's the business requirements. Next slide. And so those are why we do the things we do. Fortunately, Gallup has been studying employee engagement, and over 3 decades, they looked at several countries, hundreds of thousands of employees. And what they've identified is that companies who are in the top quartile with respect to employee engagement tend to have better productivity, better profitability, fewer safety issues, etc., than those in the bottom quartile. It's become quite accepted now that diversity is important for innovation and business, and it's becoming even more accepted that if employees are not engaged, that it will impact on productivity. Next slide. So I'm going to share with you 3 anecdotes in which, because of my focus on understanding the cultural environment in which I was working and being sensitive to cultural differences, really contributed to my own success and the success of the organization. And for each of these anecdotes, I'll just say, here's what the situation was, what was the challenge, and what actions I took. And I will comment on where cultural sensitivity really led to those actions, informed my actions. Next slide. The first situation was in the formation of Herx Marin Roussel. Herx bought Marin Merrill Dow I was the global head of R&D of Managerial Dow, which was a mid-sized company in Kansas City. At the time, they owned 57% of Roussel-Uclaf, which at that time was the largest pharma in France. And they bought it 100%, and they combined it with their own pharma and formed Herxman Roussel. And much to everyone's surprise, they turned to Frank Douglas, coming from the smallest of the three, to become the global head of research for Herxman Roussel, and 18 months later, the global head of research, development, regulatory affairs, etc. This was quite a challenge because the move, the decision by Mr. Dorman, the CEO of Herx, to appoint Frank Douglas was not shared by everyone on the board. Certainly not shared by the scientists and the union members in Frankfurt. But I moved to Frankfurt. Next slide. And in my first meeting with the senior scientists, I got about 5 minutes into my introduction of myself and who I was and what I was hoping to do, when a group of individuals, about 20 of them who sat in the first two rows, got up, said something in German, which I didn't understand, and they walked out. When I learned what they had said, it was, how can you tell us how to do drug discovery if you can't even speak our language? Next slide. And spontaneously, I didn't really think about it. I just spontaneously said, I would try to learn your language, but here's the deal. You will have to do drug discovery differently because you haven't been successful over the past several years, even though you have excellent scientists. So I embarked on learning German, and more to my surprise than theirs, they were all surprised, but I was stunned. I actually became fluent in German in 6 months. And the following happened. 9 months after I was in a position and going through many battles, I had a meeting in which all of R&D, all of research actually, some members of D, but all of research at that time were present, and I was basically rolling out the changes I was going to make in the research department globally. And I read my speech in German, and then stepped away from the lectern to the edge of the stage to do Q&A. And the earpiece I was wearing fell out of my ear. I had asked to have a dolmetscher, an interpreter, because I wanted to be sure that I understood the questions asked, because I knew, particularly from the technicians, most of the questions and comments would be in German. And so with this accident, I picked up the earpiece, and then I said to myself, and I don't know why I did, I'm just going to do this without help from the interpreter. So I did. Well, about 3 years later, I was sitting with some of my direct reports, and one of them asked me the question, I remember the first 18 months, how difficult it was. Do you know why things turned around? Now people accept the approaches that you discuss. And I said, I really don't know. I just know that after about 18 months of struggling, some of you sitting right here came to me and said, that you were now on board, and I didn't know what had changed. And she said, it was that presentation that you made, because many of the colleagues walked away and said, if this man took the time and effort to learn our language, he clearly is not the ugly American who has come to tell us to do things the American way. He respected us by trying to understand their culture. And that was what did it. People then started to turn around. So that's anecdote number one. Anecdote number two, shortly after that meeting, I brought the global group together because, of course, we had to reduce the portfolio, and that was going to lead, of course, to some groups being terminated, because all three of these companies that were merged were global companies, and in fact, the portfolios were quite similar in terms of the disease groups that they were doing research in. And I was faced with as you can imagine, a tremendous challenge here because people are going to lose their jobs. But there was something by then that I had learned that was really quite important. And that is, unlike in the US, where I guess, unfortunately, we've gotten accustomed to mergers and packages and, and looking for other jobs. In France and Germany, it is not that easy. And as my assistant explained to me, is that in Germany, for example, many of these individuals live where they grew up. And the job they do is part of their status and is part of how they are seen in their community. So it is not that easy for them if they are going to lose their position. So in that in mind, and then the second challenge that I thought of is that I also have to get them to become engaged. And a simple way to do this is the way it's often done, is you bring in McKinsey or BCG or some one of these companies to do this. And so they have the blame for whatever happens. But as I reflected on it, the next slide, please. I began to recognize that there's some important things here. One, of course, is the personal pride, particularly from the leaders, the scientists, from each of these companies. They had convinced the leaders of the company that the research approaches they were taking were amongst the best, and it would lead to very important drugs. So pride was on the line, their credibility was on the line. And also the value, how they were valued, how their groups would be valued by their boards, their former boards. Now it's just one board. Next slide. So with that in mind, I did the following things. One, I got the three leaders together, from the US, from France, from Germany. And I said, okay, you three guys, you decide on what criteria we should use to evaluate the projects. And once they had done that, I signed off on the criteria, didn't change much, just signed off on it. I said, okay, then each of you will review your own projects and you will rank them. And then I would have the three of you agree on three external experts, because we're going to have a workshop in which the senior scientists from each of the former companies will participate. You will select them. And the three scientists you will present, we will discuss, and the three external scientists will rank. And you decide on the scientists. Three, because each of you will get an opportunity to choose your scientists. And so we did that. Now, at the beginning of as we were about to begin this workshop, my assistant passed me a note which simply said that, and he was a professor. I know that Dr. Nuck knows this, that in Germany, in the pharmaceutical industry, you do have individuals who carry the title professor because that's the title, their academic title. And so she told me that Professor X had planned to make his presentation and then to make a statement, and the German group will walk out of the meeting. And so I thanked her. And I was not concerned about it because I had learned enough, because, you know, I now had been there 18 months or more, about 20 months. Learning the language had given me an opportunity to begin to understand a number of things that were cultural. And I knew that by the time we came to Professor X, if this had gone pretty well, there is no way that even if he made his statement, that the rest of the scientists, the German scientists, would follow his lead and walk, because they will see that as being really out of place. And that was precisely what happened. He made his statement, there was silence, and then he walked back to his seat. And we continued with the meeting. Next slide. The final anecdote was probably the most challenging situation that I had. It was sort of funny because it was 2000. I had agreed the year before to share with Craig Ventner the main presentation at Drug Discovery event, which used to be held in Boston. I guess it's still held in Boston. And I awoke one January morning in a sweat, because it suddenly occurred to me that Craig Ventner was going to talk about deciphering the human genome, and then I was going to follow him. What the heck was I going to talk about? So I brought together my the direct reports, the heads of various, and I told them the challenge that I had. And I said to them, look, here's a question I have for you. If there is one thing you could do to improve our ability to discover new drugs, what would you do? And so the discussion went on, and one of them finally said, you know, we understand the chemical space. We have covered the chemical space, but we don't understand the biological space. And that's where the challenge is. You know, we don't have X-rays. You know, we particularly have challenges when receptors are membrane bound, etc. And the light bulb went off, and I said, great, I have it. Craig Ventner will get up and he will tell us. I said, first of all, as you know, at this time, there were basically 4 to 5, but primarily 4 mechanisms that we use to discover drugs, you know, GPC coupled receptors, you know, proteases, ion channels, etc., kinases. And I said, Craig Ventner will get up and he will tell us how many kinases there are, how many GPCR there is. And because now we know the genes, we are going to be able to make the proteins. And now this becomes a knowledge game. So I said, okay. So I went to the presentation and presented chemical biology in the industry and described how one would do that. Now I returned to Frankfurt, and of course I've now talked about chemical biology. I have to implement it. And the challenge of implementing it is that what I had in mind was to set up platforms, chemical biology platforms, one for kinases, one for proteases, etc. And these were going to be multidisciplinary kinases, and that was an immediate challenge. The hierarchical, and particularly in a place like Germany, a hierarchy is very important, and so individuals were very concerned about how would their present roles change, and you know, what influence do they have, etc. So as I thought about it, the one thing that I had learned is that one, if you make it very clear how you will judge whether this is being successful, set clear criteria, and if you're very transparent, whereas, perhaps in the US, we deal a little bit more with uncertainty. Uh, for the French and the Germans, certainty is much more important. So I took the approach, next slide. I took the approach of doing a pilot. And then I actually engaged McKinsey, and I selected Kinase platform. And I engaged McKinsey to do the following, to develop what I call the book of knowledge, and therefore to capture the discussions, captured what was tried, what was discarded, and to ensure there was global development, because we wanted to have all disciplines that touched kinases to be part of the platform, and to be very clear on the business goal. And the business goal was basically the number of preclinical compounds that were coming from this platform, and the clear go, no go. When would we decide whether this looks like it's working, and when will we decide what the impact would be, etc., and how best to do it. And the following happened. I was in Berlin for a meeting, and I got a call. It was early in the morning, and they said there are two people here who want to see you. And I came down, and there were two colleagues I knew very well from McKinsey. And they had a proposal for me, and they said, you're trying to do a transformation here, and people are really not ready for it. You really need to do a real large-scale transformation, and we have a proposal. And they told me the proposal, and then I said, look, I understand what's going on. I'm watching it very carefully, and believe me, we have a go, no go decision, and I would be prepared to simply say, okay, we tried it and it didn't work. So, but I can deal with the uncertainty and the problems. The following happened about 2-3 months after that. This is about 9 months after we started this pilot. I was on vacation and was in Frankfurt. And my assistant, Liana, called me and said, Hans-Peter Netzler is holding a workshop, and he would like you to attend. He knows that you are here in Frankfurt. So I said, okay. I went and I sat there, and I was just astounded. I said nothing. I just listened for about 4 hours. And at the end of it, Hans-Peter looked at me and said, well, what do you think, Frank? Do you think we are ready for a protease platform? And I said, how did you do that? And he said, well, we were talking with Batzer, who was the head of the Kinase platform. We were looking at a book of knowledge, and a couple of us put together a global team. We have been meeting by phone, and this is the output. 3 months later, all 4 platforms were up and running. And in fact, those platforms were producing more preclinical compounds than the previous way in which we were doing it. Next slide. So what are the takeaways? One, respect for the language. And one doesn't have to, to learn the language and become fluent in it. I think simple things of learning key phrases and trying to. In fact, what people told me, what they found rather interesting is that here is someone who is on the board who doesn't mind to make mistakes, trying to speak the language. And I said, the approach that I had taken in trying to learn the language, I told my my teacher, I'm just going to be like a child who learns a language, and I'll make a lot of mistakes and forget the fact that I work at Herx let's just do that. And people, and the colleagues respected that because I was doing it publicly, and they saw me making the effort, and they saw, fortunately, in a way, the success. But what they saw was, and so respect for the other person's language is important. The other thing is that a takeaway is you can't talk about cultural sensitivity if you are not focusing on equity and inclusion. And I hope that the message you got from the workshop dealing with the tough problems of trimming down a portfolio and ending up closing groups in one place or the other was done in a way in which they were included. They made the decisions. I don't think there was anything that they brought to me that I actually said no. Even though at times I felt I would have done it differently, it was their work. I respected it. And it was transparent, and they could see that I was not favoring the American group. This was being handled equitably. And the final takeaway is that being sensitive to others and to their culture, understanding, how they react within their cultural context, helps people to become engaged, helps employees to become engaged. And so those are the takeaways that I wanted to leave with you. And I wanted to take it from a business perspective, because the things that I do, I always ask, what's the business case? And then have the discussion about how do we behave with each other, or what are the things that we do or should do that will have everyone become engaged. Thank you.
Thanks, Frank. Over to you, Yuan.
Great. Thank you so much, Frank, for such an inspiring talk. These stories definitely teaches me a lot about what humanity, empathy, and the mutual respect can really empower us to achieve in a global organization in terms of both business and non-business outcomes. So so when we think about cultural sensitivity, I believe different people will have different impressions or reactions to it. So to kick off our panel discussion, let's first warm up with the survey. So the first survey, Yash, if you can help share the screen, we want to ask the audience, in your opinion, which word or short phrase is most relevant to cultural sensitivity?
So the thing that we would like you to do is use the QR code, which might have come up on your screen, and you can use that QR code to input something in here, which you believe is a short phrase or opinion on cultural sensitivity. You can see we had inputted something as a test here, which was great, but I think we'll just wait on others to input.
Just scan the QR code and then add your response.
Looks like they're typing, yeah.
Yeah.
Good deal.
Great. We're seeing quite some. Okay, now there are some changes. There's respect, which is the biggest one, and then learning, humility, transparency, active listening, and great. Okay. Listening. Empathy, great. That's another good one.
Is it a good time to stop, Yuan? Do you want to start the discussion?
Yeah, so maybe let's leave it open for a few minutes. Let's see whether we get additional inputs, but we can certainly start. With that, I want to actually engage our panelists to share some of their experience. So this is an open discussion, but first, maybe I want to bring this question to the panelists. What do you think is the biggest challenge to be sensitive and communicate respectively in a multicultural environment? And can you share your own experience coping with such a challenge? Feel free to get started. Mahesh, go ahead.
Yeah, so thank you, Yuan, and again, a big thank you to Frank for such an engaging talk. I think one thing that that was quite apparent is that in trying to build trust, you have to be, be open to the idea of being vulnerable. And so I think that the fact that Frank talked about how he was willing to learn the language, he was willing to make those mistakes, I think was quite inspiring. And also in these setups, the other thing that often happens is that to be able to build that trust, it's also important to know roles and responsibilities very clearly. And especially in these situations of these mergers and acquisitions, very often one way to build trust and to know exactly who will be doing what. And this can happen because when you acquire a company, they may have a similar function that does work that is very similar to yours. And in those situations, it's very important to define roles and responsibilities and also who will be ultimately accountable. And having that level of transparency can be very, very helpful in building a strong long-term relationship with the partner or the company that is being acquired or we are being merged with. So I've often found that having that very transparent discussion about the roles and responsibilities and making sure that the overlap is very clear and who will be doing what and ultimately where does the buck stop is a key element in making sure that those long-term relationships get built.
If I can just make a comment to those excellent comments that were made, a couple of things that happened. One, after I had been in this role about 3 months, I went to Mr. Dorman, the CEO, and said, I know, of course, how to deal with Americans. I have worked with the French, but I don't know how to deal with Germans. And he said, what's the problem? I said, well, we come to a decision point and then the discussion starts all over again. And he said the following to me. He says, here's what you do. He said, first of all, they know that you're the boss, so never say you're the boss because they know it. He said, you simply say, okay, we have to make a decision for the following reason by X time. And if we don't make it by X time, I will have to make it. So that's all you do. It worked like a charm. But what that led me to do, to your comment, is that before we did anything, we talked about what would be our pre-set criteria and the time by which we will visit. And this whole issue that you've talked about with roles and responsibilities and this transparency, those are some of the things which we just, that I learned to incorporate. And that brings, as you were talking about, that brings the trust.
Any comments from you, Marcia or Valerie?
Yeah, I had actually raised my hand. Maybe I don't need to raise my hand.
Yeah.
That's okay.
Sorry,
Frank, excellent presentation. I was just captivated. I'm like, you could be a storyteller, and just, it was awesome.
Thank you.
Very helpful, as well as you, Mahesh, in your comments. And I think one of the common themes that I've recognized and kind of extrapolating from your experience, Frank, is the concept of vulnerability, 360-degree vulnerability, and being vulnerable enough to acknowledge what we don't know, right? And that's scientifically, that's whether it's with respect to business, in R&D, that's the crux of R&D, research and development. We're seeking, we're exploring. And one of the other elements that I want to maybe encourage us to change some of the branding on is the term soft skills when it comes to communication. Yet it's one of the most difficult to achieve and to accomplish, and it's the Achilles heel of innovation if we don't master it, or at least improve our proficiency at those so-called soft skills, which aren't so soft. In other words, soft versus technical. So it's the glue that holds us together. It's where we create a common language and a common, a common vernacular that helps us to communicate, to understand collectively, what does good look like? Let's say, for instance, in a merger and acquisition, and unfortunately, I've sat in a position where we had to help to define what, let's say, an acquisition strategy would look like, or what that integration office would look like afterward, deciding which functions will be retired and which will be onset. And now you're talking about people's emotions, you're talking about their livelihood, you're talking about their families in the midst of business continuity, right? And so how do we all accept the fact that we are vulnerable to external pressures, to environments, to business imperatives, to objectives, to strategies, and then have the level of sensitivity where we listen to learn and not to respond? And I think there's an adage that says that some don't listen, they wait, right? They're not listening to learn, they wait to respond. And so, when it comes to roles and responsibilities, to speak to what you've mentioned, Mahesh, roles and responsibilities in these changing environments, and those are no longer static, they're constantly changing. And to be able to have a dialogue and to be able to have conversations where we ensure that we communicate, I see you, I see where you are, I understand, or I'm trying to learn challenges and the conflicts that we may have. And even, and this is my last point on this, Frank, I thought it was incredible that you learned German and became fluent in 6 months. Now let's extrapolate that. Like, I'm sure that puts a great smile on Valerie's face. Let's extrapolate that to learning other areas that we may not be as familiar with, whether it's technically or business-wise. And what I've recognized in our research community is oftentimes when we hear of content with respect to business, ears just close off because that's not our domain, right? And we don't have a level of familiarity. So it's a matter of, a vulnerability in all ways, and us as leaders encouraging, or number one, taking it upon ourselves to be vulnerable enough to acknowledge what we don't know and to learn from others, from other disciplines, across industries, in other geographies, in other regions, and to recognize that when we do that, then we enhance engagement, we enhance inclusion, we enhance levels of respect and productivity. So I'll stop there.
And Marcia, if you kindly allow me just to add to that aspect of being vulnerable, I think it also takes courage at a point when you realize that you're wrong and admitting that you're wrong. And I think that takes a lot of courage, and that's part of being vulnerable. And so thank you for bringing that subtle but very important point, that we need, you know what you know, but then going beyond that and then admitting that if you've made a mistake, admit it, because that is probably one way where you can help everybody move forward.
Absolutely, absolutely, absolutely.
Maybe I can add.
Ja, ich wollte sagen, warum haben wir nicht von Ihnen gehört?
Nice.
Here kommen Sie.
Thank you very much for including me. No, I'm listening to all those excellent comments that were made, and I was just about to say I can offer a more humble perspective on this, because I've never been part of a merger and acquisition. I've been growing in a German company. This is why I very much appreciate the efforts you put in, Frank, coming to Germany, being conscious about cultural differences in such a complex situation and putting effort in to overcome them. And I think I'm on the receiving end, right? I told Yuan in the introduction that have the pleasure of working in a group where actually, and I was surprised when I counted it for the seminar, 50% of the people are non-German or non-American. And I think I'm in a very, very luxurious position here because all of those people took it up on them to take up a position in Germany or the US. So by definition, they are very open themselves, right? So I think it's very different for me compared to the situation you experienced, Frank. But when you would ask me what is important in communication, I think I can only build on all the excellent points that have been made. And I liked it very much that in the poll, the active listening came up because very much, as also Marcia pointed out, I truly believe that it's important to listen. And as Marcia said, with the intention not to just have a response available, but to really maybe be curious and learn about the other person that sits right in front of you. And then a second aspect that I think is important, and I every now and then truly have to admit I'm forgetting about, is to think about where the other person is coming from, and that all, the people, the environment they grew up in, the culture and experiences they make, that it sets a certain frame, right? And it might be also the current situation they're in, emotions that might come up because it has been a stressful day, to just be mindful of this and sometimes be also a little bit more forgiving, right? in what you hear and what you have to listen to. And I think that helps independent of whether there's a cultural difference or not. So
That's a great
Thanks,
point.
thanks,
That's
Valerie.
great discussion.
Yash, if I may make a comment on active listening. One of the things I learned when I was learning German, there were some days in which every word I heard was clear. I knew every word, but it wasn't making sense to me. And it happens sometimes.
Yeah.
And what that taught me was, that when Mr. Ito, said something that seemed strange, it was perhaps that he didn't actually understand what was said.
Yeah.
And so we make the assumption that because someone speaks English, that actually they are always understanding what is being said.
Yes.
So that then led me to, before we made any decision, to go around the room and ask each one what was it we decided and what they heard. Because of that experience I had in trying to learn a language, and I understand every word, but I don't understand what it said.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah, thanks for that perspective, Frank. I know we're about to launch a poll that we would like everybody to pass. So before we do that, I think Mark had joined us, and Mark is a global leader himself. Mark, as you're listening to this, any specific comment that you would like to add to this from your varied experience?
Oh yeah, so can you hear me? Yeah.
Yes, we can.
Okay. Thanks everyone. I don't have anything to add. I think that these have all been really excellent points, and I'm thrilled with the engagement and interaction here. So nothing additional from me, I don't think.
Can I grab Mark's time then? So it's just but 10 seconds to piggy off of something you said, Frank, that is really, really insightful. And that's this. And I'd like to encourage those that are attending as well to think about this when we hold, let's say, presentations, town halls, group meetings, and if they're global in nature, we learned that from the standpoint of global participants, and especially if those meetings are in English, to slow down, right? To slow the pace so that there can be time to ingest and interpret and understand what's said, so that those that are attendees can also participate. But by the time they translate and understand, the moment has been missed, and it'll seem as if they're not as engaged or not as interested or not contributing, but it was because of a language processing, the speed of processing the English language or any other language. So I just wanted to raise that because it was interpreted as being reticent rather, and non-engaging. So something to think about in terms of being culturally sensitive as well.
Absolutely.
That's such a good comment. And actually it's naturally bring up to the second topic about how cultural sensitivity has been realized or like some efforts that your organization have been putting into. So before that, let's have this additional poll. In your opinion, which of the following is the most important benefit by improving cultural sensitivity in your organization?
I did launch the poll, so I think you should be able to see the poll right now. All the attendees should be able to. I do not know if the panelists will be able to.
No, the panelists cannot, but the attendees should. You're right.
Okay.
Yep.
Yeah. So would request the attendees to look at the poll, and if you could add your thoughts to that. And as that is happening, maybe Yuan, do you want to continue with the next question for the panel?
Right. So our next question is asking the panelists, what are some efforts your organization is putting in to promote cultural sensitivity, and how does it work so far?
So maybe start with Valerie with you. We'll go the reverse
the other way around.
Opposite direction, counterclockwise.
Sure. So probably also to set the scene, I guess I'm at a site of Boehringer Ingelheim that is deeply rooted in the south of Germany with a lot of employees coming from there. And I have to admit that, like, I think some 14 years ago, I did an internship at our site in Richfield, where this was a topic already, right? And it was very eye-opening to me because I learned a lot about how they want to deal with us as a German culture. And then I joined here 10 years ago, and it wasn't much of a big topic because I think the site I'm at became more and more international as I actually joined there. And what they did over the years, but probably much later than all of you have experienced in your companies, is to really anchor the values of diversity, of equity, and also inclusion in our code of conduct. And this is kind of a little booklet everyone gets upon joining BI. And it really describes that this is something that the company consciously decides to promote on different levels, right? Be it by hiring decisions, by engaging leaders to also foster an environment where one can be respectful and fostering trust, by actually sharing failures, just as you described it before. And I think I experienced over the last maybe 3 to 5 years that, there are awareness campaigns, they have awareness weeks dedicated to special topics. There are lunches that you can join. And I think it also started 3 years back, where they launched a huge empowerment movement, as they called it, where the big focus is really putting the employee at the center and empowering them to stand up for themselves, and giving us as leaders also tools to have those conversations, right? To engage with our teams on a very low level, kind of in discussions around fostering trust, empathy, respect, and that is something that I at least perceive as very positive. Though I'm ashamed a little bit in this round, because I'm gonna speaking to people who've been dealing with this topic for so long, that at least the way I perceive it as an employee, it only started a couple of years back.
Thanks, Valerie.
Yeah. Should I go next? Or?
Yeah, sure. Sure, Marcia.
I actually sit on our firm RGP's DE&I Council, Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Council, and I'm one of the founding members of the council and that particular capability. And some of the tools and the support that we provide are, number one, we host town halls with the entire organization. We held one about 2 weeks ago, and the topic, not so coincidentally, was on non-bias and cultural sensitivity, because we support clients around the world across industries. And so tools such as, how to discuss how people may want to be addressed. Now pronouns is a thing in terms of, right, not making assumptions on how people want to be addressed. And as well as we have a portal that houses all of these tools and enablements and capabilities on how to be culturally aware. You have to first have an awareness, and then we move into sensitivity, how to engage between colleagues and even with our partners, external partners. What does good look like? And that you're not going to arrive at your full destination, and we're not going to achieve nirvana, if you will, overnight. but it's a journey, and measuring where we are on that journey and how we're improving, and also listening to those voices that may not resonate what you may feel like you agree with. But if you listen, have one-on-one conversations and dialogues, it again helps us to expand our body of knowledge so that we can improve our environment. And then lastly, one of the other levels of enablement we provide are ambassadors across the globe that sit in all the various regions, ambassadors who can support one another and can also help guide us on how to interact with one another. And one of the questions that came up in one of our town halls was from some of our APAC colleagues who wanted to know, and they were able to be very transparent and very candid and open. How do we address African Americans? Do we address them as African American? Do we address them as Black? And we should be comfortable to have those conversations and create those platforms. So I was able to speak to that, of course, from of course, I'm obviously, a Black American. I was able to speak to that to help to provide tools and guidance so that we're not so nervous with each other anymore, but we feel like, we're colleagues and we're partners in this thing. Okay, I'll stop talking there. So those are ways that we're approaching and providing support and guidance and enablements and tools.
Yeah, maybe move to you, Mahesh, and ask Frank to help us conclude this. But I would like to inject a question that came from the audience, which was also to include how do we deal with virtual meetings and the virtual remote setting these days when we think about this topic. So Mahesh, to you.
Yeah, so I think, and maybe just to extend what Marcia said, we live in this very interesting post-pandemic world where, I have people sitting in Japan, China, Spain, reporting or having a dotted line or even a direct line into me. And with these, in trying to build relationships with people, not only how do you address them, I often have difficulties, how to pronounce their name. And in this yes. New interesting virtual world, I think it's perfectly fine to ask somebody kindly how they would like their name to be pronounced. And yes. It starts with some very simple things, and these go very goes a long way in building these relationships. And as part of building these relationships, it's about the trust that you can build, and it has to do with emotional trust. Mm-hmm. And it comes by valuing the ability to build long-term relationships. And so, being able to talk candidly with people and showing them that you're again, going back to the aspect of being vulnerable. And when you open up, no matter whether it is a face-to-face interaction or whether it is a virtual interaction, when people recognize that you care, that is when I think is the place where doors open up. And I think that works, whether it is a face-to-face interaction or a virtual interaction.
So as Frank would ask you to maybe conclude, I know we are right at time. If you don't mind, I'll just launch our last poll question. I think this is a topic of interest that we would like to keep on bringing back in from this ISOP working group. So Yvonne, could you speak to that question? Let's launch it and let's ask Frank to conclude the meeting.
Sure. So our next survey question is, what other topics specific to cultural sensitivity, diversity, equity, and inclusion would you want to hear about in the future?
And while we're getting those answers to the poll, there was a question around some approaches to how we manage virtual meetings. I'll give some ways that we're approaching it. Number one, having a sensitivity to time zones. That's with or without virtual meetings, in person or virtual. A sensitivity to time zones, not having to necessarily have a full half hour or an hour meeting, but cutting those to a 25-minute meeting or a 20-minute meeting, also maybe a 55-minute meeting, ensuring that everybody's engaged, and including them in the conversation. And then in some cases, it's not a requirement, but encouraging participants to have their videos on so that we ensure to have interaction, and so that people are not checked out, giving people time to refresh themselves. And the last thing, if their dog is in the video meeting, then it's okay. If they want to hold their dog, let them hold their dog, right? And we'd be patient with interruptions at home and things like that, if people are working from home, and many are these days. So just wanted to kind of throw that on the table in terms of addressing that question quickly.
Thanks, Marcia. Frank, take us home. I think we are a couple of minutes over, but I would request the panel to stay back for another minute or so. Frank, would love to hear your, as you heard the panel, your thoughts.
Yeah. One thing it kept me thinking of Mr. Kaufman, who was the founder, CEO of Marion, had a simple statement, and that was, treat others as you would like to be treated. And I think that's a basic thing. You know, no one likes to be treated as though they have no value. No one likes to be excluded. You know, so to treat others as we would like to be treated. The second thing, which was being discussed, the differences in the cultures, which we should take time to learn. That shows the respect for the culture. One of the things I learned in Germany, which I happen personally to like, my American colleagues did not like at all. The Germans are very clear in the difference between a friend and an acquaintance, and they do that in their language. An acquaintance is Sie for you, as opposed to du, for you, and it clarifies things. And so I happen to like that. My colleagues didn't like it at all because they found it very formal in a way. But that is so important because if you do a German where you don't have that relationship, they could be offended by it. So there is an example of a simple thing in another culture that you learn. I'm quite sure there are lots of such examples in every culture. So my take away message is the one: respect for people and treat others as we would like to be treated.
Thanks, Frank.
So those are my closing thoughts. Thank you.
Good deal. That was wonderful.
Thank you so much.
I would really like to thank everybody, and also on behalf of the ISOP working group, and especially Yuan and myself. I know we have been engaging with you and trying to get this together, at least get the topic on this started. And thanks for trying to start this topic. I think you'll hear more from us on this topic, and would love to see you here and discuss this topic in the future. Because this is front and center, and we would like to continue digging our knowledge from all across the world on this topic as we continue. So thanks again. And we have a few minutes over. We apologize for that, but I would really appreciate you staying back.
Thank you, and have a happy holiday.
Happy holidays.
Happy holidays.
Happy
everybody.
holidays.
Take care.
And thanks a lot, attendees.
Thank you for the
Absolutely.
invitation.
And I have to say thank to Teresa, who helped us organize this. I know she also was able to join in. Thank you so much, Teresa.
Okay. And
Excellent.
so Valerie, ich wünsche Ihnen einen guten Rutsch ins neue Jahr.
Selbe wünsche ich Ihnen auch. Vielen Dank.
Sounds so beautiful. That was just the perfect ending.
Thank
Take care,
you.
everybody. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
So it went okay?
Yeah, it went okay. I'm just copying and saving my, whatever we got in terms of responses, so that I can share it with the team.
Okay.
Thank you so much, Teresa. We could
Oh,
not
no
have done this
problem.
without you. Like
Do you want to stop the recording?
yeah, I think we would be good to stop the recording. And do I stop it? Okay.
Yeah, I don't have control anymore.